Greetings, everyone. My name is Livette Coney, and I am the leader of White People Challenging Racism, Moving from Talk to Action, WPCR for short. I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of WPCR. We are so grateful for the commitment to engage in this important discussion. But before we start, let's take a minute to acknowledge that the land where all of our homes now sit was once the land of Indigenous people. Indigenous people have lived in Massachusetts for 12,000 years. If you look at the welcome signs in the town or city where you live, you would think no one lived here on this land before 1635. The founding date of 1635 erases the native history, culture, and people of any given town or city. In a Yes Magazine article, the author Ana Cecilia Perez reminds us that, quote, white supremacy informed the founding of the United States. When it comes to Native Americans, the goal of white settlers was to kill all Native people to take their land. When killing every single one of us was not possible, it became necessary to erase us by forcing us to assimilate, contesting our nativeness, end of quote. For Black people, it was the opposite, because the goal was to own as many Black bodies as possible. We were never meant to be free. So let the welcome signs in our towns and cities be a reminder of the two original sins of American history: the genocide of Indigenous people and the enslavement of Black human beings. And let the signs spark our learning about how these two forms of white supremacy persist to this very day in our communities, and what we can do to disrupt them. As most of you know, since 1999, WPCR has been running a workshop series that aims to educate and, importantly, to activate people, especially white people, in the work of dismantling white supremacy in ourselves, in our families, and in our communities. We have talked about the wealth gap, and the racial wealth gap in particular, and how it was created through intentional policies and practices. But we have not talked enough about the implications of this wealth gap for our personal and collective commitments to racial justice. So a bit of background. In 2019, white people, who now make up less than 60% of the United States population, held nearly 84% of the country's wealth, while Black people, who make up a little over 12% of the US population, held just 4%. This gap, which has remained pretty consistent over the last 30 years, is widening. Another snapshot comes from the 2015 The Color of Wealth report, which puts the average net worth of white households in Boston at $247,500. For Black household, it was $8. Let's be clear, this gross imbalance in the distribution of the nation's wealth is no coincidence. It is the result of generations of white supremacy through violence, exploitation, and theft. It's time for us to ask ourselves some hard questions, like, what does it mean to have more than one share of the pie? Or what is the prognosis for racial justice when white people control the lion's share of the nation's fiscal resources and continue to hold fast onto this ill-gotten wealth? And finally, why can't we embrace concepts like Ubuntu to recognize our humanity through economic justice? So part of showing up for racial justice is honestly engaging with these questions and more. And we hope tonight's program will be a step in that direction. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us and being in community with us. My name's Corey. I just have a few housekeeping items to discuss before we begin our conversation. The general schedule will have about 20 to 25 minutes for each panelist to present. We'll have about 20 minutes for discussion among the panelists, and then we'll have 25 minutes for questions from participants. So, you can begin filling your Q&As, submitting your questions now, and there'll be time for questions at the end. One other thing I would like to add is I do want to build some time for silence. This is not polished podcast. This is a discussion. We might want to sit with what we're hearing for a minute. It takes time sometimes to make the connections or to build an insight or to make a comment to a question. So silence is fine, and it's part of the learning process. And so that, we will encourage that. And so yes, now I just want to give a very quick introduction to the panelists, who will then introduce themselves in the time they have in their presentation. So first, we will hear from Stephanie Guirand, coming to us from the Black Response. Then we will hear from Becky Pierce from Dorchester People for Peace, also outreach to white communities. And then we will hear from Julia Gabbert from Cambridge Heart and Showing Up for Racial Justice. And so I will turn it now to Stephanie.
Okay. Hi, my name is Stephanie Guirand. I am a poor Black immigrant cis woman. I'm also here as a member of the Black Response. Our biggest claim to fame is that we initiated the community process that led to the Cambridge Heart model. We are also working to operationalize the organization and ensure its viability beyond our lifetimes. I think it's connected to the conversation we're here to have today. More about Heart later. We're here to talk about shifting resources, specifically middle-class white people shifting resources to poor people of color. You need to know that poor people, especially poor people of color and poor immigrants, invest more than their fair share into their communities. They invest money, time, materials, ideas, and more, just a ridiculous amount. Poor people exchange money constantly. They help each other pay bills, they give each other rides to work, they purchase goods for one another. And in my neighborhood, everybody bought sweets from the icy lady, they got their hair done at the same spots, they watched each other's kids when someone needed childcare, they did so much for each other. All of these things are monetizable. But for poor people, it's an investment in social capital. You never know if you need food. You never know if you'll need childcare or if you'll be short on cash. So poor people invest. These exchanges are investments into their communities, and they pay back many folds. We have come to think that wealthy people are philanthropic and middle-class people are charitable. I want to argue that we should all be investors. People have a sense that investment needs to yield some sort of financial trackable reward. We're incentivized to hoard money in banks and institutions. We're taught fortune favors the bold. The reality is that wealthy people are hoarding social capital. They are rewarded for changing and molding the world to fit their vision. They are investing. You need to participate too. I want to suggest that investing in ideas is everybody's responsibility. However much low-income people invest in their own ideas, it isn't enough. By design, we do not have enough to invest to make our ideas flourish. Instead, we need to plead to the wealthy for investment. The wealthy shift and mold our ideas because that's what they do when they invest. We have to make concessions that may ultimately undermine our overall goals. The institutions that poor people create ultimately fail. They fail to endure. Over time, we are under the impression that poor people's ideas are not as good as those of the wealthy, or that perhaps middle-class people are better at convincing investors. None of this is true. But we need to add more investors to the table. All of you need to become investors in social capital. You want to end homelessness? Invest. You want to end police killing? Invest. You want to end structural racism? Invest. Invest, invest. I want to convince you that we, the poor, know best how to solve our own problems. We understand our problems. We understand the institutions that create our problems. We understand the politics that we navigate to solve our problems. If we had our own institutions, we could prevent crises. We could end violence. We want to end violence. Cambridge Heart was an idea. developed by poor people. We collected community data through a participatory action research process. We developed an alternative public safety program. We learned from other alternatives about approaches and interventions to interrupt violence and support people in crisis. We trained community members and pay them a living wage. We are saving our own lives. With more investment, we can develop heart into an institution that outlives us all, but we need investors. This is where the resource shifting begins. I will pass it to Becky.
So I grew up with the concept of stewardship, meaning the responsible use of my time and money resources for the good of the community, as well as for my own wants and needs. This is probably because my parents' community and their activism were the church, to which they gave 10% of their income and all of their spare time playing the organ, directing the choir, and running the Sunday school. Later on, they also wrote the church, which was the UUSC by then, into their will, giving it 20% of their estate, the same amount they gave each of us 4 kids. This roundtable is about the racial wealth gap, so I want to just say that for me and most other educated middle-class white people I know, we don't like to think of ourselves as wealthy or of having wealth. So the way I have dealt with this is to define wealth as whatever money and real estate I have beyond what I need to meet my and my family's basic needs and live a modestly comfortable and secure life. So if this is how you look at it, this could be a big or a small amount of money. That doesn't matter. It is wealth. What we're looking at tonight is the reality that a huge proportion of people in this country, and even more in the rest of the world, don't have their basic needs met. And those folks are way disproportionately Black and brown and BIPOC and other people of color, but Black is, one that's the most disproportionate. So the tool or habit or practice I have used when making big financial decisions is to figure out how much money I actually need, which involves doing some math, which I like to do. But if you didn't like to do it, you could get someone to help you who did like to do it. And how much more I have that I don't need. So the amount that I have that I don't need, I am free to do what I want and think best with. This is a kind of thinking that has led me to use my resources in a way consistent with my own values. And that is the only judgment that matters in how I use my resources, my values, and what I think of myself. So I have been able to do this by figuring out what I need and what I don't need, and still have a wonderfully fulfilling and secure life. So here are some things that folks can do if they want to use some of their wealth to reduce the racial wealth gap. These are things I've learned from my own experience. You'll probably think up other things to add when you take a creative look at your own situation, whenever you're ready to pick one or more things that you want to do. The first and easiest one is giving away 10% of your income or any other percentage that you choose. This is easy to carry out by just moving the 10% to a separate column in your checkbook every time you deposit a paycheck or log an electronic deposit. Another one is sustainerships. You probably already do some of these. Commit to monthly or quarterly donations, ongoing forever, to Black controlled social justice groups. If you receive an inheritance or some other unearned windfall, give away a percentage of that off the top, perhaps a bigger percentage than you might choose to give from your earned income. If you are a war tax resistor, give away some or all of your refused federal taxes rather than putting them into an escrow fund. If you have retirement savings, Move some of that money to the Boston Ujima Fund, which invests in wealth building in Black and brown neighborhoods of Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan. Other loan funds, there are many loan funds that invest in racial and economic justice. Many other loan funds address the racial wealth gap by supporting community-controlled affordable housing, such as the Institute for Community Economics, and many other community institutions combating housing insecurity and many other manifestations of poverty and systemic racism. If you are a homeowner, you can give or will your house to a land trust in order to keep it permanently affordable to low or moderate income people, rather than have it sold at market rate after you die and thereby contribute to further upward pressure on prices and rents. Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust acquires and preserves affordable housing in BIPOC Boston neighborhoods. There are actually a number of ways you can give part or all of the value of your house to a land trust now and continue living in it and exercising ownership control over it as long as you need to. If you own a house with one or more units that you rent out, keep your rents affordable to working class tenants rather than setting them closer to market rate. You can charge only what you need to cover your short and long-term landlord expenses plus a modest profit if you need one. If you have excess rental income because your house is already paid for, you can further lessen the racial wealth gap by donating that extra money to a housing justice group such as City Life Via Urbana. If you do have retirement savings and are close enough to retirement, say 10 years out or whatever, to have an idea of how much money you're likely to need per month beyond your Social Security and other pensions, you can make a thoughtful estimate of that amount and add an amount that feels right to you for unforeseen needs, and give away the rest to support Black racial justice organizers or groups. And lastly, you can revise your will to give part or all of your estate to a Black controlled social justice organization. Most of us grew up assuming, without questioning it, that if we had kids, we would just will everything to them. But many of us have already helped our kids to buy a house. So they already have generational wealth and huge financial security. You may be able to do such a thing separately from your co-parent if they don't share your willingness to do this. You can also talk to your kids while making such a decision and let them know who you are giving part or all of your estate to instead, and why. And that parental example might do even more to counteract the harm that white generational wealth, starting with slavery in the 1600s, has done to Black families' chances of surviving and thriving. My time is up, at least, but I can say more about how I arrived at these financial decisions and actions in my own life later in the program if folks have questions.
Thank you, Becky. And now we'll hear from Julia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Corey. My name is Julia Gabbert. I have several affiliations, but for tonight, I want to just communicate that I got involved working with Cambridge Heart a couple years ago through Surge and have been helping out with their fundraising work a little bit. And my career has been in the nonprofit space. Most recently, I was running the major gifts team at a Boston-based social change organization. And I'm currently doing some fundraising consulting and figuring out my next steps. I'm excited to be here tonight because this is a subject that is so challenging and deeply personal to me. And I've taken on a personal mission of getting white people to get over the fear of asking for money and talking about money and owning our relative privilege compared to our Black and brown friends. And there's a few things I want to communicate tonight. And the first is that it's okay to have feelings about money. But the key here is to not let feelings get in the way of you acting on that money. And I think we just have to kind of reframe and what money means, right? Money makes the world go round. It's a fact of life, and we have a responsibility to evaluate our relationship with money. Because if we shy away from talking about it, we give it too much power. If we waste it or spend it without intention, we take away the power. And if we give with intentionality in line with our values, there's real beauty in the power of money, right? It's all to say that we all need some form of money therapy. And yes, I'm speaking from personal experience here. My quick story is that I was raised in a mixed class household. My dad's side of the family was a family of entrepreneurs, and my mom's side was a family of farmers. And my grandfather lived through the Great Depression, and the tendencies that he had very much impacted my mother. And we were very much raised towards saving at all costs. We were upper middle class, but I had no idea based on the messages that I was sent, right? It was drilled into my head from an early age that saving equals good, spending equals bad. Messages about giving beyond, donations at the passing around at the church was not something we talked about. And I was one of 4 kids, and we would get a prize of who got the best deal when we went back to school shopping. When I waitressed in high school, my mom was so proud when I came home with good tips, right? And sometimes my mom would inadvertently shame me for asking for lunch money in school, right? It was like, again, you're asking for lunch money? So I started to see how far I could stretch my lunch money, and it'd be the cheapest and most unhealthy things, but I just didn't want to have to ask my mom for money again. So these are just a few examples. I say this all because it takes intentionality to examine your relationship with money. And we've been sent messages about money, socialized with this idea of what money means to us from a very early age. So I really encourage everyone to kind of examine their own relationship with money. And a little bit more here. I was politicized in college, took a class on consumerism in the United States that kind of changed my whole worldview. And after spending a couple of years as an executive assistant, I was recruited to join the major gifts team for this organization I worked for a really long time. And I was so scared. Me ask for money when I have so much baggage with money, right? Like, how could that possibly be something that I could do? And I took a lot of deep breaths. I gave myself a lot of pep talks, did a lot of money therapy, and figured, like, if this is what the movement needs of me, this is something I can do. So, and then it was fine. I asked, people were happy to give. It felt good to help power an organization I believe in. And yes, it was hard, but like, we can do hard things. We can get over our relationship with any baggage or trauma we have with money through, if we work on it. And if you're someone who does have guilt or shame around money, a great antidote to that shame is to spend your privilege and put that money to work in line with your values. I have more thoughts about that we can get to too. The second thing I wanted to communicate is that your money makes a real difference in these communities. What may seem like a small amount to you is really meaningful money to groups like Cambridge Heart and some of the groups that Becky mentioned. And these groups are operating on a shoestring budget so your $20 a month or $500 a year is hugely impactful. Just to say it bluntly, right? Like, while we white people are in our feelings about money and how much we should give and determining the exact right giving plan and maybe can I even afford this, right? Money is going to real work in these communities and impacting people's everyday lives for the better when we're able to just separate ourselves a little bit from that money. And the third thing I wanted to say is, people who show up to a panel like this tonight are people who get it, right? Racism would have been solved if we're up to Black people, right? And getting the people who already care to give, who show up to something like this, should be the easy part, right? Like, we are the people who get it. And so I think I want to encourage everyone to let go a little bit of control of where their money is going and trust, right? There's a tendency for white people to want to know exactly what their money is doing, and that has deep roots in history to welfare programs and beyond, right? There's a lot of control. And this practice is harmful, it's condescending, it's binding, and there's so much liberation in letting go, trusting, and it gets results. And just think about, if we're able to give more freely and more regularly and with less strings attached, how much more time the people receiving the money, either an individual or a group, could have if they weren't spending that time reporting back on where the money went, but actually just doing the work. So I'll leave it there for now. Points that I wanted to say are just like, it's okay to have feelings about money, but use them to act. Your money makes a big difference in these communities, and these movements need people who get it to dive in and give or be involved in mobilizing resources from wherever you are.
Thank you very much, Julia. That's fantastic. So now I just want to give some space and take a minute. You've each, made your comments like a chance to build on each other's comments, or some of you mentioned, that you would have more to add. And so this is that time to be sure you say everything you want to say, but just initial reactions from the panelists about what they're hearing from the other panelists.
Stephanie, I wonder if you might say just a few things about like what Cambridge Heart is.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of this conversation, I think it's really important to think of Cambridge Heart, as an idea about how to interrupt cycles of violence and harm. But a great part of the work is really shifting resources within this institution. One of the key things that we find ourselves doing is mutual aid. And that mutual aid happens in the form of like financial mutual aid. Somebody needs money to turn their phone back on, right? Or somebody wants to take this class, got accepted, figured all the things out, and then their rent went up and they just need the difference so that they can do the course. So people just need money. And so we help facilitate mutual aid within the community, but we also do referrals, transportation. We just help people make plans for how to avoid crisis. We're really doing a lot of thinking through on how to interrupt violence and cycles of violence and address harm, and thinking about how to develop long-term plans for addressing the really tough questions in the community. And all of this costs a lot of money because it takes a lot of time. It takes a whole lot of time. We're a small group. I don't actually work for Heart, I'm on the board, but I work for another teeny tiny organization, right? The Black Response. And Heart in particular has 3 full-time admin staff and 7 full-time responders, and our operating budget is $750,000 for this tiny organization. But last year, and we were only operational for about 7 months of last year, we moved $7,000 from community members to individuals in need. We filled 124 orders. We have, I think now, the last I checked, there was something like 30 individual cases of people needing long-term aftercare to help develop their plans and follow through with support, whether it's, completing forms and getting access to housing, or just coming up with a plan and then seeing it through. So the work that we're doing is the work that is needed for the community. And there's a lot more that's needed for the community. And it costs a lot of money, but it's really hard to convince people to give money to this because there's a history of people feeling mistrust when it comes to poor people running their own things. Yeah, and so I think, yeah, that's what heart is, that's what it does. And in the context of this conversation, it's really about how do we shift resources to the actual work that's being done when poor people develop their own ideas to solving their own problems. How do we convince people with more resources than us to help us make it happen? And then how do we make sure that that lasts? Because we can start it now, but if I get tired or if I get injured, you know, we can lose everything that we've worked hard to build. How do we endow the Poor People's Campaign here? I think those are really complicated questions. And as a person who has no money, I will inherit no property. It's really hard for me to even think about how much money to ask a person for. And so I'm doing a lot of work on trying to figure out, like, asking someone for $500, that sounds like a ridiculous amount of money to me, but it's not. People just have $500 to give, and it's not gonna mean that they can't pay their rent this month, and it won't mean that anyone has to go without food, which is really hard to conceptualize, right, as a poor person. But this is the work that we can all do together. Like, if you can do it, then you should do it. If it won't hurt you, then you should do it, because it will definitely, literally save lives.
So, Stephanie, I was really glad to hear in your presentation and just now when you're talking, everything that you as a poor person and a Black person, which is not coincidental that you're both, that poor communities do to use the resources that they have of community to survive. And I think it's just very impressive what all the organizing that you're doing and that all of the people that you're working with. And it shows that that if people that have, if white middle class people or anyone else who has resources to give to you wants to reduce the racial wealth gap, that putting our money into a poor Black organized and controlled effort, it's the way we can do the most. We can get the most bang for the buck in reducing the racial wealth gap, because we're giving it to Black people who are, and poor people who are at the bottom of what you might, you know, the wealth ladder in this country, and the end of the huge gap. And so that in giving away our money and deciding where to give it to, groups like this would be the place. And the Boston Edema Fund is the only thing that is comparable that I know of, although, well, I won't say that, but because I've given money to other Black community organizing efforts over the course of my life. But I'm just saying that what we need in white people challenging racism, in Surge, in any or any white anti-racist activists who are serious about using the money that they don't need for their own basic needs to reduce the racial wealth gap, because we need to find out all of the groups like yours that are out there. Meanwhile, I'll put a lot into heart. Yeah,
I've just have gotten to know Stephanie well over the last couple of years, and I'm just really inspired by the commitment to a vision and to an idea. And I was really responding to Stephanie's idea about investing in an idea and in a community and a vision of what you want the world to look like. And I know many of you know Mariam Kaba's line about like we need like 1,000 experiments. And I think Cambridge Heart is that, right? It's like an idea, it's a vision, it's a world that is different from the one we live in now. Like, it is an answer to the question of like, who do I call if I don't want to call the police, right? It's a alternative response where you can like have a community-based team of people who show up to you when you're in distress. It's like, it is the experiment in action. And I love the way Stephanie describes the organization being like by people and for people. And I think that by the people and for the people of Cambridge, for example. And I think there's to start to kind of answer Eric's question that he put in the Q&A, there's a lot to be said about like what makes an organization good, right? That's another question, right? Like Cambridge Heart isn't going to show up in like the database, what's like the Better Business Bureau database, right? It's a brand new organization. It doesn't have the ratings. It hasn't gone through the GuideStar notification. So part of like deciding if a group is good is like, if you get a good sense from the people who are leading it, if you like the idea, right? Like there are tons of ways to actually like do the data on it. But like, if the organization is interesting to you, they're doing a good mission, and you get a sense of trust with the person leading it, that's great. How do you get a sense of trust leading it? Maybe you have a group that endorses the organizations. I know Surge, for example, endorses all of the organizations that have been listed in the chat so far. So like maybe that is enough for you, right? Maybe you do need to do the data dig, but know that those GuideStar ratings in particular are super nuanced, and there's a lot to say about like an established organization with a ton of extra resources getting a higher rating because they have the resources to submit all the paperwork to get that higher rating, right? So there's kind of a positive feedback loop, and a lot of the groups who are doing the best work aren't able to be calculated in that way. So that's just a quick thing, but we can talk about that more later too.
Julia, I have a question for you. What would you say the hardest part about shifting resources is? Oh, there are more questions coming in, but we can start there.
I think the hardest part about shifting resources is that's tricky. I mean, from a personal perspective, sometimes it's hard to just like make the ask, right? Sometimes that's the hardest thing. I think for a group like Cambridge Heart, it's like getting the names of the people to be able to even ask folks to give. I think it's the marketing. I think it's like getting the name out there and knowing that this is the thing that needs to be funded in a really like, there's a lot of nonprofit groups. There's a lot of things that need funding, like making your mission stand out, I think is the harder one. And I think there's the other side of that is, people thinking that they don't have enough money to give when anything actually really helps, right? So getting more people involved and getting the word out, I think can be really challenging, especially for a newer organization.
I'll just add to that. What was
Yeah.
really important for our relationship when we were developing Cambridge Heart, we didn't know what we didn't know. And so it was super helpful for you to come in and say and ask us like what we're doing and get to know what we were actually developing, but then helping us figure out what we needed in order to do that. And I think that was part of the problem, right? Like we didn't have Network for Good to collect the funds.
A database. Yeah.
Yeah, so like very basic foundational things we just were not familiar with, and I think we come across that all the time. But we're also familiar with lots of things that we don't know who to share the knowledge with. I'll give an example, and I think this is a good one. In December, before Christmas, we have this partnership with The Spot, and they get lots and lots of donation. And there was so much before Christmas, and people didn't know about the free bicycles that they had there, and like sneakers and toys and all sorts of things. And so we decided to have a community mutual aid giveaway. And at that giveaway, at the same time, we were thinking about like developing how we were going to track our effectiveness as an organization, like how the work that we're doing, how do we know we're doing it well? And so we decided that we needed to define community safety. So we would ask people who are part of the HEART community, how do they define community safety? And so we just put a whiteboard at this mutual aid event, and we're just like, how do you define community safety? And 500 people turned up to this event and like cleaned out everything that was at this mutual aid event. And we had about 160 responses to the question, and a lot of it was young people responding to it. And they responded to the question of how do you define community safety with secure jobs and affordable housing and housing security. And naturally, that was baffling, because if we wanted to just copy and paste metrics that come from the police department, for example, they don't measure their contributions to affordable housing, right? And so then we have to develop completely different key performance indicators that are measuring our ability to support people in feeling and getting securely housed and feeling securely housed. And how are we helping people get good jobs and secure jobs? And then how are we tracking that long term? And so then we have this really challenging task of thinking with people, because they know what they need, right? People need jobs and people need housing, and that is what makes people safe in a community. And so how do we then figure out how to measure that, how to track that, and then share that with other stakeholders? And I think this is like a key example of how HEART is completely different from other organizations. Like, we can't just copy and paste other people's approaches. We actively struggle with the tasks that we're given by the community. So, okay, we're developing performance indicators that are around housing security now. And it's been incredible, because we're contributing that to a larger discussion around alternative public safety and in our dashboard development. So like, we're not just tracking that, we're sharing that with other community members. And we're writing about the process of developing them and sharing that with other alternative public safety programs. And if we hadn't asked a bunch of people who would turn up to this mutual aid event about how they define community safety, then we wouldn't be contributing this important knowledge to other programs all around the country who are developing their trackable metrics. So I think that's a good example of all of it. I saw in the chat, someone wanted to know what social capital is. Social capital is this very strange term that's being thrown around in lots of ways. I think you may hear social capital as like this intangible asset that people gather from having others know their name and know what they're capable of. So I think that's like the basic definition of social capital, but it's also like the value of someone's potential in different communities and different spaces. And I think of that as incredibly important for us to think about, because the way that wealthy people use their financial capital is that they invest in social resources and then attach that to their name so that we know that it was them who did it. And so then we think of that person as contributing something valuable. At the same time, though, they are working to shape conversations, politics, research, however they wish. And we need to do a better job at investing in our own communities so that we can shape our communities to do what we need them to do for the people who need the world to work in better ways. So I think that's how I would define social capital.
Becky, I guess one question I had for you is, this is not a society that is great at looking after its elderly And the general advice for saving for retirement is you're not saving enough. So how do you have the confidence to know, or give us the confidence we need to know that we have plenty? And it sounds like you've done that. And I guess if you could just give some more encouragement to that, of like giving us certainty that you can make a ledger and give this to help others. If you could expand on that, that would be great.
Well, I think the financial advisors and the going approach of white middle class and up people to saving for retirement is you need to save everything you can possibly get, and it still won't be enough, and it's going to be in millions. But I think you can't have absolute certainty that you won't run out of money in your old age, or that something really terrible won't happen to you, and then you won't maybe end up in a nursing home. But I think I would rather have certainty that I was saving a reasonable amount to maintain a modest lifestyle and trust that I will be okay. If something really terrible happens, and that I would rather not hoard every penny that I have when there's such dire need now for people who are dying in the streets because they don't have enough to meet their basic needs. So I just think the answer is that the idea that we have to hoard everything for our old age because something might happen 10 or 20 years from now, and something bad might happen to us when there's so much bad stuff happening to people all the time, that it just, we need to balance our values against our fear that we might not have enough for everything we want, 15, 10, whatever years from now. And I came to this feeling when I was working a lot with the Boston Jobs Coalition that Chuck Turner, when he was alive, was leading. And I wasn't working a lot with them, but I was in close touch with what they were doing and supporting it. And they were at a point where they couldn't continue their work because they didn't have money to pay his salary, and he was in dire need. And that was a point at which I was thinking that I probably had more retirement money saved than I needed. And so I just thought about how much I was probably going to need beyond my Social Security per month, and determined that was $250 or $3,000 a year. And I figured I'd probably have 20 years to live, maybe. I'm 78 now. I could live to be in my 90s or maybe even more. And decided to give away a large chunk of it. It actually was half of it. It was half of the 165,000 that I had. So I'm now working down slowly at $250 a month because I've been retired for about 5 years. The rest of it, and nothing terrible has happened. A few things have happened where I had to take out a little bit more, but I figured that in, and I've had a little bit of earnings since I retired, and that's helped. And but I own my house, with my partner, and we have rental income, and we've given our house to the land. We've built our house to the land trust, and we're trying to give half of the value of it now by giving the land under it, which will make it into land trust. And if we put protective covenant, or we put covenants on the deed, which is so that it can't be rented or sold at above a certain percentage of the area median income. In other words, a certain income level. Then we can keep it permanently affordable. And so that's what we're doing. But that means we still have control of it as long as we're here, even though we can't raise the rent ridiculously high if we have the covenants on it, which we don't want to do anyway. So all this. So we're very wealthy, even though we don't have huge piles of money. We have enough, and And we have this house here, so we are very secure for our old age. People who own their own house are secure. They're not going to lose their housing, or if they do sell their house, they'll have enough money to do something else with a little bit of luck, or to pay for a good, it's just, people need to not feel like they have to absolutely secure a wealthy, a luxurious lifestyle with all of the options that they could ever want. If they care about any kind of racial justice, or using their privilege and power to promote equity and fairness rather than just hoarding it all for themselves. So I think it has to be some balance between what you feel is just and fair in the world, and whether you really do believe that.
Right.
As a white person, we have an obligation to undo systemic racism and the racial wealth gap and racial oppression.
And it gets back to what Julia was saying about values. Our values should be represented in the money. And then what Stephanie said was very powerful of, if we want problems to go away, we need to donate our money to make them go away. And I think that, it's a remarkably clear way to think about it. And it's definitely, since the pandemic, I've been surprised that I've become aware of the food insecurity in my own community, and that has been surprising. And that's clearly something, that I should put more money towards. And I guess, Stephanie, one question I had, I think you touched on this with the when you mentioned the mural and the group meeting, but you said there was community data was gathered as when Cambridge Heart was starting up, which sounds really fascinating. But it also, was it like from those sorts of workshops, or was there more? Did that require money or time, or how did that work? I guess if you could fill out how that worked.
It was a 6-month process that required community members to survey each other. So we surveyed, we had several rounds of surveys asking targeted questions. And the first broad survey that we conducted got over 400 responses. And it was like, what do you want from a community alternative public safety program? And then we asked them more targeted questions about the types of interventions that people needed. And we also held weekly meetings where we brought in speakers from other alternative public safety programs, and learned from them about their process, about their programs, about their challenges, and then had focus group discussions and took notes of those focus group discussions. And we took all of that data together and developed the HEART model from that. I also think it's really important to talk about all of this in the context of the racial wealth gap. First of all, I don't even really know what wealth means. I'm not saying this just because I call myself a poor person, but the concept is really abstract to me, right? I have this sense that people have more money, they have so much that they never have to worry that they won't have enough. So that's how I think of wealth. And it's such a foreign concept to me that's part of the reason why I was encouraged to institutionalize the idea of communities supporting each other. And it's a different type of wealth to what we're talking about, but it's really about understanding that people of color, in particular, Black people, Indigenous people, and I'll speak for myself as an immigrant who left a very dire situation in a third world country in the middle of a failed state, to think about wealth in what I've lost in that context and coming to the US and having zero, right? I had zero, which is nothing, but I had so much more than nothing. I came from a country where people who look like me were doctors, lawyers, and everything. So I never had a concept of me not being able to become anything I wanted. which I think that's the biggest challenge when we're talking about racial wealth, because it's this feeling that of inferiority, that you cannot become anything, and having a very limited worldview and a scope of who you can become. And I never had that, right? And so I'm super fortunate that I've always felt like I can do whatever I choose to do. That said, what I have chosen to do with my life is what I've seen my mom do, which is like help everyone. So growing up, I grew up in public housing in Cambridge, and we always had people sleeping on the couch. Like there was always somebody who needed a thing. And we always sent huge boxes and drums full of supplies and foods and things back home. And I continued that, like that's still a huge part of my everyday life, because I understand that I could have been the one in need of those things, and I can still be the person in need of those things. And for me, when I'm thinking about addressing wealth gaps, it's really about how do we make sure that we've institutionalized the systems that actually work for us. And so for me, it's not about money, because I don't have that. I'm employed and I'm grateful, but I don't own any property. So I'm not thinking about how I'm going to use the money or the land that my family has. I'm thinking about how do I use the knowledge that my family has, and how do I like institutionalize that to make sure that everyone has access to those things. And I think it's really important for us to consider that the racial wealth, the wealth could be in knowledge and practices, as well as the finances, but the finances are absolutely necessary to develop those institutions. And some people in the chat were writing like that they wanted to have universal healthcare. I want universal healthcare, and I want universal childcare, but we can develop those things for ourselves. Like what are some creative ways that we can use for us to develop those things to make sure that they exist, whether or not Washington or the State House decides to actually pass laws to do that. I hope they do, and I'll work to make sure that they do. In the meantime, we can create those things together. So how about we all pool our money and our resources and develop those things anyway, and work towards developing or closing the wealth gap by also things that are obstacles for people, to prevent them from being able to self-actualize and create the things that they can contribute to the world. Those are my thoughts.
I love that, Stephanie. Thanks for sharing that. And one thing that you said really resonated with me about your kind of own questioning of like, what is wealth and what does it mean? And that idea of like not needing to worry about ever running out of money, I think is a very like astute observation. And I was reading Colin's question in the Q&A, who was asking about white reluctance to part with wealth and the relative generosity of poor people. He says, where do you think these opposing ideologies about money come from, and what has it taken for white panelists to shift their ideologies here? And there's probably some like sociological nerdy answer that Stephanie has around like where that origin is from, but I wonder if it is that like idea of people who have wealth don't need to worry about money, and they never want to give that up, right? Like now, once they've got that, they never want to give it up, right? So it becomes this hoarding thing where I remember Corinne, one of the directors of Cambridge Heart, talks about, passing the same $20 around in the community, right? Like this person needs to pay their hospital bill. That person needs to, get a ride to pick up their child, right? There's always money being passed around. And because it's like the way that Corinne talks about it, like there's no choice but to turn to each other. Whereas like people with wealth have a tendency to I don't need anyone. I have the option and the choice to insulate. So therefore, why would I need to? I mean, this is kind of philosophical, but I would love to hear other people's thoughts on this. Where do you think these opposing ideologies about money come from, and what has it taken for the white panelists to shift theirs? I think it's like time and energy saying like, you know what, I have more than I need and I have a responsibility to give it away, in like a super short answer. But that's a really good question, Colin.
Julia, you've done major gifts for organizations, and you're doing that for Cambridge Heart as well. Like, are there differences in how people are responding for what you're asking for Cambridge Heart compared to other organizations, or are there barriers we should know about or prepare for?
Good question. I think one anecdote is that you know, we've been trying to get more multi-year gifts from folks. So asking people for multiple years of gifts, because that helps organizations plan ahead, right? That helps people to like look in the future and be like, we got a $20,000 donation this year. If we can count on that next year, wow, we could budget, we could think ahead, amazing. And one of our donors who we had this conversation with at Cambridge Heart said they weren't ready to do that because Cambridge Heart is still a startup, right? I'm happy to fund you month to month at like a significant amount each month, but I'm not ready to make a multi-year gift just because who knows what could happen. You're still getting up and running. So I think that's challenging for an organization like Cambridge Heart to kind of get established, because it's like a chicken or the egg thing, right? Do you get established by like having funding you can count on, or do you have funding you can count on so then you get established, right? So I think it's a true challenge to get up and running. I would say that's the biggest thing. And also the second thing is that people just don't have as much baseline of trust with the organization yet, because they don't know us yet, you know. But we know that when people get to know Stephanie and the other leaders of this movement, that they're gonna like what they're doing and see that they're extremely trustworthy people with hearts that are so invested in the community. But it takes time and energy and staff resources to make those phone calls and introduce yourself and thank you for your gift, right? So there's some real challenges in getting up and running, and I think that's the biggest difference.
And Stephanie, when we were planning this, discussing this a few days ago, you had mentioned hyperlocal. And as a White People Challenging Racism co-facilitator, you know, when we do these workshops, we talk about spheres of influence and dismantling systemic racism. So like, I live in Melrose. It's a city where Black home buyers could not get a government-backed mortgage until 1968, and we're a Metco school, so we're bringing Black students come in. We can see from data there's disproportionate punishment of Black students compared to white students. We don't have the student body. The educator composition does not reflect the student body. There are far fewer Black teachers than there are Black students, but so a lot of that's where we're a lot of my work had been like, let's try to address Melrose. But you challenged me and said, hyperlocal can also be 5 miles away. It's not just where you're voting, it is where you're living, where you're situated. And I just wanted to share that anecdote. If you want to add to it, please do. But the money shouldn't stop where your voting booth ends. That there are communities where the capital is welcome, and it will be put to the people who need it know what needs to be done. But I wanted to thank you for giving that perspective, and if you wanted to share anything else, this would be a good time.
I can't remember the question that we were answering. It was a very good question, so if someone remembers it, that would be really helpful. What I do remember of what I said was that our communities are, not just like our neighborhoods, but all of the places where we interact with people. And I think I was talking about my walking club and the volleyball community that I'm part of. They're like super diverse spaces. Obviously, like all of the organizing work that I do introduced me to great people like you guys. And so we can get to know lots of different types of people from the activities that we're a part of. And so that's really also very important. And then I saw a question, Cheryl. Is there a role for white people to do useful things for heart in addition to giving money? I mean, yeah, share your knowledge. I think part of what Julia is doing and continues to do, and it's not just Julia, we have tons of volunteers who support us in various capacities, but sharing like expertise and like training other training community members to like learn useful tasks like grant writing or fundraising. We have a whole mental health working group where we have doctors, social workers, people with lived experience who discuss all sorts of mental health related questions with the Cambridge Heart responders. And that process, that we have this iterative process of developing our protocols that we have within the mental health working group. We have a similar working group for domestic violence. So any sort of expertise you have, like we'll take advantage of that if you give us your time as well.
And yes, to go back to the very first question that Jennifer posted, I'd like to question the notion that white people can give wealth that was ill-gotten in the first place, a result of intentional policies and practices to keep money and resources in white hands. Isn't this more of a question of repatriating wealth, returning it to where it belongs?
There was a person who put, I thought Ujima stopped taking investment money. I also say that, like, I'm not directly involved with Ujima, but one of the principal organizers of it, it's part of this national campaign for restorative economics, which would be very interesting to have in a future discussion, Amaka Abo. And what they talk about in restorative economics is really thinking about the entire ecosystem of financialization. So the marketizing of specific harmful outcomes, like the surveillance industry in policing, for example. There's a whole financialization of that. Investors giving money to create tools that are used to harm communities. And so how do we dismantle those types of systems, and how do we actively encourage people to invest in counter products and counter storytelling and legal services, and in maybe even developing products that are useful to communities? Like Cambridge Heart uses Patch, which is our dispatching software. They actively needed, they're anti-police, like they're about organizations that are doing alternative public safety program. And part of the challenge with their work is that there's not a market that's like developed for them to collect resources from investors who understand the need to develop a completely separate market to advance these sorts of initiatives. And I think restorative economics, I mean, I'm only scratching the surface of restorative economics, but I think that is connected to the conversation that we're having around this. Resource shifting. Resource shifting is not just, it's not specifically about racial wealth gap, but I think in investing in all sorts of dismantling of institutions that create harm and investing them in institutions that actively dismantle harm is part of the work that we need to do. And Ujima is obviously a great place, local place to start. And a national organization is Katali, and they also fund Ujima. So I would encourage you all to take a look at their work and encourage you to give to them as well.
And I also wanted to call out Lily's question about has anyone had conversations with their children about estate planning, reduced or no inheritance?
I mentioned that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so how did that go? I mean, was understood or supported?
Yeah, but it started out with, we had willed our house to our son. We have one son, and we willed our house to him, and as well as everything else, because that's what you do. And we hadn't questioned that idea, and we became very involved in anti-displacement, affordable housing justice work, which we've been involved with city life for decades. And then, about 10 years or so ago in Dorchester, where we live, it started reaching a crisis level of escalating rents and displacement and evictions and foreclosure evictions and all that. And we were, I took part in eviction blockades and all kinds of stuff. And so we were housing justice activists, and we started thinking about giving our house to the land trust, as the land trust was, I wanted to give part of my wealth to our son. And my part was my share of the house. And because I don't have money, my partner has more money saved from inherited and stuff. But so we had this idea of giving the land through a ground lease, which is a way that the land can be owned separately from the house, and giving the land to the land trust now. And we're still trying to do that, but the land trust is going great guns, using all their capacity, acquiring more affordable housing and preserving it, and they don't have time to work on this particular piece, which is a house they're going to get anyway. So that's kind of on hold for a few years, but but the idea was we could give the land to the land trust, and that would reduce the sale value of the house by about half, because the land was at a premium in a place like Boston, and then will the house to our son. So that was the first plan. And so we were going to will the house to our son and give the land to the land trust, and then and put covenants on the deed so that it couldn't be sold to any old rich person for the lower price. It would have to go to somebody who needed to be able to, to a middle class or low income person who could afford to buy a house at a lower price. And so we were going to have covenants like that. And also it has 2 small rental units, so we had covenants to keep those rents affordable, which we're doing now. We're renting them at a third to a half market based on what we actually need to get in rent, and what the people can afford. We have one tenant who'd be out on the street if we raised her rent from $750. And so anyway, we went through, so we talked to him at that point when we give our son our wills, copies of our wills when we revise them and update them and whatever, and write them. And originally the will had the house going to him and his wife. And so we talked to him about the idea that we wanted to do that, or that we were going to do that. And he was in support. He didn't feel like we owed him anything. And he and his wife are making more, probably at least twice our household income. And even when I was working. So, they don't need it. But we did talk to them. And, I having one child who is a white male, middle class, educated, gender non-conforming, cisgendered, non-disabled person, he is at the top, almost at the top of the ladder of privilege, and he's never going to have any trouble. And even if he had went broke for some reason, so I was thinking all this time about generational wealth and passing it on to my even more privileged son, so but I still wanted to give him something when I gave away my inheritance money, and I'm not going to have any money when I die anyway, unless I die unexpectedly before I use up my $250 a month from my retirement fund. So we did talk to him then, and then a few years later, like a few years ago, he and his wife decided they wanted to try to buy a house and stop paying thousands of dollars a month in rent. And they had both gotten some raises in their jobs and stuff like that, but they still couldn't buy a big enough house for what they needed with what they had. And we were able to give them enough money to have a down payment to get the house they needed. So once that was done, we said, okay, the house is going to the land trust as well as the land under it, and it's going to be willed to the land trust, and they didn't have any problem with that. And they have racial justice values too, although they're more working on queer issues, and they're both bi. They met in a bisexual support group, and environmental stuff. And he's an environmental transportation geek working for the T, and so they have good values, but they certainly are anti-racist in their beliefs and convictions, and support our being that, and our housing justice, and we're also involved in environmental and housing justice activism and a few other things.
One question that came in just now is, you had mentioned that you've done a lot of deeds and estate planning. Are there resources that we could share that other people could guide folks to maybe make similar plans about land trust or covenants? And I mean, if you want to look and put it in the chat or email it, we can try to send it out. But that's a question that just came in, because I think
the only thing that we've done, and we haven't done a lot of independent research, but we've talked to the Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust, and who have been up and running for about 3 years, I think. They have other people besides us who are interested in giving their houses to the land trust, but and so they're in touch with a lawyer who does that kind of stuff, who outlined for the group of us who are interested in giving houses or willing houses or whatever to the land trust to keep them permanently affordable. And so they have some stuff about that. So I would say to contact them and ask them that question of what are the various ways that you can give your house and still have the use of it for as long as you need, and all that kind of stuff.
That's great. And I thank you. And I see Eric put a link in the chat. So that's another place people can go. So we're moving into closing. Anything else from any of the panelists that you would want to be sure to say before, the floor is yours, I guess. Any final thoughts?
I'll try to connect this all. I have a lot of thoughts right now. Well, thank you guys for organizing this event. It's been really interesting to hear. In different contexts, I do a lot of research. I'm a student. I do a lot of research around housing justice and exclusionary zoning in African descended people. Happy to talk about that in some other contexts if you guys are interested to hear more. And so I think it's really important that we have these types of conversations, and that we have multi-generational conversations, and we have various class levels and cultures represented in these conversations. One of the spaces to that question that was asked before, that we have these sorts of conversations, complex ones about like what is needed in the community and who we need to serve is this coalition of individual community members as well as representatives from different organizations. And in it, we talk about what are the things that are needed to develop the community safety landscape. And so even though HEART is an alternative public safety program, we know that safety is facilitated by the food pantry workers and the housing agencies and the social services agencies and all of the services that exist in the city together. And then there are these gaps in between. And so we need to have these conversations about how do we fill the gaps and which gaps can we fill and what can we learn from the gaps that we can fill and the gaps that we haven't filled. And we have these sorts of conversations in as well as who we need to reach out to in order to get the resources we need in order to develop resources to do the work that needs to be done. So we have a coalition meeting on Mondays at 3:00 on Zoom if you guys are interested. But I think part of the work that we need to be thinking about in terms of how we close the racial wealth gap is consider that the violence that exists in our communities, not the white collar violence, but the physical violence that exists in the communities are manifestations of hundreds of years of racial discrimination, as well as current deprivation, right? Poverty has real impacts and it manifests itself sometimes in violence. And if we are able to service each other's needs, then we can interrupt cycles of violence. But it also manifests itself in crisis, and we need organizations to support people in crisis. And so we need to be able to train people to support people in crisis. And that's the work that we're trying to do. And it's not just an idea now, it's like actually in operation. And we need to figure out how to make sure that it's not just another failed idea that won't endure. And I think this is the really challenging part, because I'm really fortunate that I'm a student and I've gotten to travel all around Europe, and I see these great big buildings and lots of institutions, and they can boast hundreds of years in existence. But that's not working class history, not even in Europe. And so we get to think that that these wealthy people are so great because they created these institutions that can withstand, the test of time. But the reality is that we need to be creating those institutions now. And we have the great opportunity at a time of tremendous wealth to reallocate those resources to building institutions that can last. And that's what we should be talking about, right? In terms of closing the racial wealth gap, there's so many touch points that need to be addressed to close all the gaps. And we're doing our part in developing support measures to address the specific violence and crisis that prevent people from being able to shoot for the stars. And then it takes support from people with more resources to make that more secure.
I did want to thank all the panelists. Thank you so much for this time. And want to thank Claire for tech support. And if she could put in the chat, the donation link for Cambridge Heart, and also thank White People Challenging Racism. And we'll put the link for WPCR, and we'll let people know they can look at upcoming workshops if they wish to enroll in a White People Challenging Racism workshop, which I highly recommend. And I want to thank Jane for pinning all the speakers during the Zoom call. And I want to thank Jennifer for organizing our notes and our talks. And Livette, if you want to say the final word, I do want to try to give you that space.
I want to thank you all on behalf of WPCR for attending this evening. And we are so grateful for your commitment to listen and engage in this important discussion. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you, Livette, and thank you everyone for being in community with us. And again, thanks again to our panelists and all the work they do and all the giving they do. And hope everyone stays healthy and has a great year.